Hi, everyone. My name is Kesselheim, and I'm pleased to talk to you today about incentives for drug development in and to talk specifically about learning from the experience of pediatric exclusivity to answer the question of how do we better promote use of cancer drugs or testing of cancer drugs in older adults. These are my disclosures. We don't have any relationships with any pharmaceutical company. The proposal today that we're talking about is how do we increase the rigorous informative testing of anti-cancer drugs in older adults so that we can be sure that these patients get the benefits of these products and minimize their risks. And one of the proposals that I want to talk about is whether we should follow the lead of pediatric drug development by providing for additional market exclusivity as an incentive for drug manufacturers. And just to back up, I want to talk first about what what this means and what market exclusivity means. And basically, after a new drug is FDA approved, pharmaceutical companies get a period of market exclusivity that protects their drugs from direct competition against generics or biosimilars. And during this time, the U.S. allows pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever they want, and pharmaceutical companies charge monopoly prices that far exceed the cost of production to make up for investment in research and development, and also to make the substantial profits that we've come to expect from the pharmaceutical industry. The market exclusivity period is defined by a floor and a ceiling. The floor is set by the Hatch-Waxman Act that guarantees all new drugs a minimum of about 6 to 7 years of market exclusivity, although some products like biologics get a minimum of 12 years, and is set at the maximum by patents, which last 20 years, but the key underlying patent protecting a drug is usually obtained around the time the drug is synthesized. And although pharmaceutical companies will then get numerous additional patents on their products, but in general, we've done some studies on this and found that the average market exclusivity period for new drugs is about 14 to 15 years. And so the idea was to leverage this market exclusivity to provide additional incentives for testing drugs in children. And the motivation here was that few drugs were being developed or studied specifically for pediatric patients because of the smaller market that pediatric patients make up for new drugs. And this is important because children have important physiologic differences from adults, and so drugs are being frequently used in children without supporting clinical trials, and therefore children were receiving treatments that were ineffective and even dangerous. And so, as a attempt to solve this problem, FDA and Congress came up with a couple different policies that can basically be categorized as a carrot or a stick. And so the carrot is the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, which provided 6 additional months of exclusivity added on to the end of their normal market exclusivity period that provides additional opportunities for pharmaceutical companies to charge these monopoly prices for their drugs if a pharmaceutical company responded to a written request from the FDA to test their drug in children in certain for certain conditions. And then PREA, or the Pediatric Research Equity Act, that was the stick. That was passed in 2003, and PREA actually required pharmaceutical companies to test their drugs in children before they were approved, and to test the safety and efficacy of the drug, supporting dosing or administrating the drug in pediatric subpopulations. However, the PREA also included a waiver that allowed PREA studies in children to be waived for rare disease drugs, or for impossible or highly impractical studies. Those could be deferred until after the drug was approved, instead of doing it before approval. And so this carrot and this stick were two policy options that were intended to try to increase the number of tests that drugs were being done for children, and actually had some real benefit, and in some ways. So the BPCA, for example, out of 450 written requests for 242 drugs, that led to labeling changes for almost 300 products through 2018. And this was a chart from a paper we published in NASEM a few years ago. These labeling changes involved information about new dosing or dosing changes, pharmacokinetic information about these drugs, use of these drugs in pediatric population, and PREA actually had even more labeling changes, and as you can see, PREA has become more common more recently, and most of the PREA labeling changes involve indication expansion, again, which is what we're looking for here in the case of cancer drugs for older adults. And so this seems to be a positive outcome. However, there are also a number of negative outcomes that have also been observed in the application of the BPCA and PREA. So with the 6-month market exclusivity extension, one of the concerns that's been raised is that a lot of the drugs that end up getting pediatric written requests are the drugs that are more popular among adults, not the drugs that are the most, have the most public health importance for children. A lot of the studies that are done under the BPCA are subpar, have been found to be subpar quality, lacking randomization or blinding or other markers of high quality studies. A lot of them haven't been published in the literature. It's been observed that BPCA studies can be delayed until closer to the end of market exclusivity, because if you're a for-profit pharmaceutical company, it makes more sense to invest the money in doing the pediatric study closer to when you're actually going to get the benefit of the 6 months of exclusivity extension. Then that would be closer to the end of the market exclusivity period. And then it's also been observed that a lot of these studies are being organized in easier pediatric populations, which is to say older children, rather than the more complicated variety of subjects and maybe even younger children, again, in whom the drug might be more relevant. And then finally, this was a study that we did in JAMA Internal Medicine showing that pediatric, the 6-month market exclusivity extension was a major over incentive, that the median cost of doing the trial was relatively small on average. And you can see there I've highlighted the oncology row of median cost of doing these trials on average was about $41 million, and the 6-month market exclusivity extension pulled in a net return of hundreds of millions of dollars. So providing an overall about a 7-to-1 profit ratio of the net return on the cost of investment. And so these are major profit centers for pharmaceutical companies. And so in PREA, there were also concerns about implementation. First of all, what we've observed with PREA is that waivers and deferrals are now common. About 4 out of 5 drugs get their pediatric research studies waived or deferred. And then when those studies are deferred until after the drug is approved, they can take a really long time before the pharmaceutical company completes them. This was a study that we had published in JAMA Pediatrics in 2019, showing that for drugs approved between 2007 and 2014, after a median of 7 years, only about a third of PREA studies had been completed, and it was much more likely that the easier safety and pharmacokinetic studies, rather than the more challenging efficacy studies, were being completed. And so this is obviously not the intent of the PREA statute. So how does this apply to this question of testing cancer drugs in older adults? And so obviously, I think we all agree that we need to test cancer drugs in older patients, but I would argue that offering additional market exclusivity incentives as a benefit for that is problematic, because the problems that we've seen in the pediatric exclusivity market outweigh any benefits that you might get from it. And I would also point out that the logic is also not the same. That the logic in the pediatric market is that this is a market where not a lot of people are going to be prescribed this product, and so we need to provide incentives to try to get testing in this area. In the cancer drug space, once you get a new cancer drug approved, it's really the case that most patients for most drugs are going to be older patients that are going to be getting these drugs, and so we really do need, there really is a vibrant market of people for whom these drugs could be tested after approval. So, what are the things you could do? First of all, we could require, as we do with PREA, require new applications for cancer drugs to incorporate trials that include a representative sample of older adults. And as a way of ensuring that those tests are done in a timely fashion, we could require that the FDA re-review drugs after a certain period of time and change the labeling, or even in extreme circumstances, take the drug off the market if those studies haven't been done. And, we could also leverage observational experience with the drugs, given the fact that most of these drugs are going to be prescribed in older patients anyway. We could leverage observational experience to fulfill these requirements when scientifically appropriate. Another option would be directly funding these studies through the National Institutes of Health, rather than providing a substantial additional market exclusivity incentive, the government is going to be paying for these drugs anyway because of all the amount of money that they spend on drugs through Medicare. And so funding them directly up front through the National Institutes of Health is a more efficient way of making sure these studies are done. And then finally, if we are going to go down the route of thinking about a market exclusivity incentive, setting a predetermined award rather than letting that award be determined by the revenue of the drug would be a much more cost-effective way of making sure that drug was done. So maybe making the award be, twice the cost of the clinical trial or something like that, rather than making it be, based on whether or not the drug is a blockbuster, that, allowing some pharmaceutical companies to get, substantially excess awards for their investment. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to discussing some of these issues in the group.